I'm super excited to be here on this agency call. Thank you all for coming. I've been an educator for over 10 years now, and I haven't had a mental model for what agency looks like or how to foster it. As a child, my parents didn't believe that I should have opinions or that I should be an agent of my own learning or anything, that I should just follow directions. And so it's not surprising that it's hard for me to have a mental model. I'm excited to have all the experts here to talk about how to foster agency. So some of the questions that I'm hoping we can answer today are, what is it? How do you foster it? And what are the things that we should and should not do as educators as we think about assessing for it, monitoring it, and creating learning environments that help it to develop? This call is different than a lot of our other Yellow Hats calls because we have a panel discussion. This means that if you are in the audience listening, if you type things into the chat, members of my team will tree questions up to me, and then I will, put them to the panelists. The other thing is that it's not lost on me that we have a panel where there are no students, even though we are talking about student agency. We did that intentionally. This is part one of a two-part series. And the second part will have students. We felt like they needed a full hour all on their own to share their opinions uninterrupted. And so that's the rationale for having the two-part series. Lastly, we're not going to spend a lot of time on bios and introductions and all of that. We'll do something really briefly, but we'll send a bunch of resources and bios of the folks who are on the panel. So let's get started. And I'd love for the panelists to go around and introduce themselves. I want you to say your name, the agency that you work for, and one super interesting thing that you are working on right now related to student agency.
So I'm Camille Farrington. I am a senior research associate and one of the managing directors at the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. And so one of the things we're working on now is the Building Equitable Learning Environments Network. And Transcend being one of the 10 organizations involved in that network, and really trying to understand what does it mean for schools to have an equitable learning environment, and what I would say what's the role of agency, of student agency, of teacher agency, of family and community agency in creating and maintaining those kinds of communities and spaces.
Hi, so I'm Drew Schroeder, and I work for the New Tech Network. We're a national network, a school design model that kind of operates all across the country. And my primary role there is Director of Assessment. One exciting thing that I think I'm working on in relation to student agency, all of our schools are sort of aimed at developing student agency, but I'm in particular working on a project in South Carolina, working with some schools that are kind of from the traditional kind of corridor of shame, if you remember back to that documentary. And so really thinking about cultivating student agency in an environment where students are situated pretty far from opportunity. And so it's just been a really interesting place to try to bring our model into fruition, and kind of like, as Camille alluded, it also involves quite a bit of work with adult agency as well.
My name is Charles Cole. I'm the founder of Energy Converters. And one of the things that we're working on and I'm really excited about, we have this 3-phase process with our young people. And their process and their research starts with what is interesting to them, what they feel ownership over. And then we work from there to kind of connect that to larger education themes, and then the ways in which they can lead impact on their own, either with the school or without a school. So that's one of the things that I'm really excited about that we're doing.
Hey everybody, Mark Murphy. I am the founder of Grip Tape, and one of the interesting things we're doing is trying to exist at the boundary of what most people perceive possible, and that includes putting actual dollars in the hands of young people, up to $500, and allowing them complete and total decision making over what they learn, how they learn it, and how they measure the success of their subsequent learning. We are then connecting them with youth all over the country to support each other. So it's both a individual level of agency in pursuit of your passions and your dreams, as well as an ability for youth to support each other in that endeavor.
How you doing? I'm Ramon Goings. I'm assistant professor of educational leadership at Loyola University, Maryland. And the work I'm engaged in at Loyola is that I teach school leaders. So those who are getting their admin certification to become principals. And one thing I'm doing in my research, which looked at diversifying the teaching workforce, is that I'm working with a program called Pathways to Teaching. And they're in high schools working with students to get them interested in the teaching profession with a focus on students of color because they're vastly underrepresented. So we see that program as a way to get students thinking earlier about how can they use education and being a teacher to kind of create change and take over and take back their communities.
Nice. All right. Thank you for all of that. This is the spirit of our call, panelists. We want to have fun, be specific, be brief, use clear and short examples. I'm the moderator, but everything does not have to flow through me. So feel free to talk to each other. I'm going to encourage you to talk to each other. And we want to encourage like lively, productive debate because it's a complicated issue. All right. We're just going to get started with the basics around like definition. A lot of folks, define agency as choice and giving kids decisions and power. So a lot of you alluded to that as part of the kind of work that you are doing. How do you feel about that definition? Is it overly simplistic? Is it nuanced enough? What do you guys think? How would you define it?
I think I don't see anything necessarily wrong with the definition. I think we can word kill things to death. But I look at one of the ways when I talk to my young people about agency and this term, like it's become this nebulous kind of term. And if the term isn't accessible to them, it doesn't have any meaning. So when we talk about it, we talk about the ability and the will to execute what's best for you, but also with like a knowledge base to be able to determine what's best for you, right? So if I just ask a young person what their opinion is, and I haven't instilled a certain level of knowledge or base there, they might not do what. But we have real conversations and showing you different things and exposing you to different things, then the ability to actually demonstrate agency grows. So that's how we tend to talk about it when we're discussing that.
Charles, that resonates with me in the way I think about it. I think if we think of kind of being a conscious person who has authority over your own life, and that you can act on your own behalf and make decisions about your own life, that there's not people deciding for you, or not just in the absence of you doing something, you just get slotted into a particular track. So it's that notion of really seeing young people as kind of active beings and subjects, not objects, and being able to decide for themselves and according to, in the terms, like on their own terms, on the things that matter to them, and to be able to define those terms.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I need to jump in right after Camille, both for two reasons. One, both of her comments and Charles around self-authoring really resonate with me, and just this idea of, at a conceptual level, kind of that's what agency is all about. For our network of schools, we've tried to operationalize agency a little bit more specifically to help, because it's one of the formal learning outcomes that all of our schools try to support students in. And we have kind of like a two-prong definition with some various domains around agency. One half of it comes straight from Camille's work around teaching adolescents to become learners, and sort of the academic behaviors that are sort of predictive of strong academic success. So one whole set of a huge part of our agency rubric actually is trying to help kind of describe what those academic behaviors look like in a strong student-centered project-based model. The other side, and that's the more behavior side of our definition, at a more kind of reflective side, we also try to incorporate all of the research around growth mindset to help students have a sense of their own efficacy and effort and practice for growth. So we sort of have both the behaviors and the reflective sense of yourself as a learner to try to help people put it into practice.
Yeah, when we talk about the definition of agency, you know, there are a lot of words around, like, not allowing, a few of you said this, like not allowing someone to make decisions for you. Our system, our education system isn't set up to really allow that to happen. And so it sounds, it's like such a noble thing to want, right? That kids can make decisions on their own. What kind of mental model do adults need in order to like allow that to happen?
So I could speak to that because I train the teachers and that the ones that become the school leaders. And what I'm finding is when they come into my class, they're used to being told what to do as well. So it's an interesting experience when I give them some autonomy to make their own decisions. They're like, wait a minute, this is not how teaching and learning goes. So it's really kind of like redefining what teaching and learning looks like for kids. I think it's built as a kid and it kind of goes through the teachers, and it's how teacher ed programs work. So I definitely think there's a remodeling and kind of rethinking that we have to do in order to change our views of agency with adults in particular.
Could you expand on that and just say, like, what do we have to do, right? Because it's hard to shift people's mindsets. So what are the things that we need to do with adults to help them create the right mental model to allow them to grant kids agency?
So I think, I'm thinking in my class, I have to give adults the time to make mistakes in terms of how that looks. So creating spaces where adults can make those mistakes and kind of experiment. What does agency look like if I allow students to do X, Y, and Z? Kind of have really opportunities to do things where it's not, your job's not on the line. And some of those things, because I think teachers are really thinking about that when they're working with kids. Because if I give them too much room, is it going to impact my testing scores? So we have to really kind of think about, I just let them like, here, we need opportunities to make mistakes. And I try to figure out in my class how to allow them to do that and then to experiment with their students and how that looks. Again, depending on the context of your school, it looks vastly different.
My mind instantly went to parents and then went to community folks. And the reason why is I think it's just as vital to build up the agency of parents, especially if you're dealing with urban folks in schools that might not be performing super well and don't have a good track record of performing well with urban kids. But I try to build up the agency in my parents to kind of say, hey, a school is one factor in building a knowledge base and survival skills for your young person. But you have, I want you to have the audacity to demand like, quality. And I need, and then this is what quality looks like. This is the places where I've been and this is what I've seen from quality, but also to not lose the things that have helped raise us before and do well. Like the institutions in your community, whether that, in the past, that's been like the Black church and the mosque, or it's been like that community center, or just if you're working with Black kids, like that successful Black man, it can kind of see that person and see them reflected. So I think I like what the good doctor said about teachers, and I agree. I think that they need those places to kind of learn and those grounds. Yet and still, I think Black and brown kids in felon schools have dealt with what I think these parents would say they've dealt with what feels like experimentation for a long time, right? And it's like, and not to be long-winded, but also sit on the board of a hospital. And the way that our families with agency act in our doctor's offices versus the ones that don't. Let me just give you a quick example. When the poor Black kid comes in with his mom, the conversation is something like, don't touch nothing, don't ask nothing, listen to what this doctor say, let's do what we need to do and let's get up out of here. And the privileged family comes in and their conversation with their child before stepping into a doctor's room is different and saying, hey, this is your doctor. This doctor isn't, this person is responsible for keeping you healthy. You need to have your own relationship with this person. You ask as many questions as you want. Those two nuanced conversations set up something really different, right? And I think when we talk about agency and going deep, like I think that that's one of those deeper kind of levels. It's what do I expect my school to do and what do I expect it to look like? And when I'm not getting what those things are, what do I do? Because for my mother, my mom thought that good teaching was if I was happy and I didn't get my name written on the board. She didn't know there's supposed to be a unit plan and a goal for the day and things of that nature. So if I don't know what to expect off top, how can I even expect, and I can't, and these parents don't have agency, how can I then expect these students to have agency?
I appreciate you going there. I made a comment earlier about my parents not feeling like I should have agency. You know, I come from an immigrant family, and so it's one thing to build up their knowledge base about what to expect. But even with my parents, what they expect is, you know, for the school to provide an education, not for the school to help me have opinions. And so what's something concrete that we could be doing with communities to help not only build their knowledge base, but help them with that different expectation or to see something differently?
Yeah, I think the more that, so young people can't develop agency if they don't have the opportunity to exercise autonomy and choice. So that's a like number one thing. And that no one can, adults aren't going to appreciate what young people can do unless they see them doing great things, right? So I think that having one of the most persuasive things for adults, whether they're teachers or parents or community members, is being able to see young people when they actually have autonomy and choice and support to take on a real problem that is a problem that's socially recognized, and that they make headway on that. I think that's the single best way to persuade people that this is a good idea. But you can't, you have to see it, and kids, young people they don't demonstrate agency or develop agency in the absence of opportunities to really make real choices.
Mark, you've taken this you've taken this from the angle of doing this outside of the school system. And is there a reason why you chose that angle? Is there anything about mindsets? Tell me more about that.
There's a lot of reasons. And the core reason is that every single thing that we do is designed by kids, everything. And so this is how kids designed it. And that is actually ultimately how kids are executing it, because they have an opportunity to bring it into the school, and the vast majority of them do not. I think that the core, the root of it is that I, as a young person, feel that I am told what to learn, when to learn it, how to learn it, whether I learned it at all. It can be a very disempowering experience for our kids. And when they have the opportunity to exercise and practice significant levels of agency as it pertains to their learning, the school is not the place that usually resonates with them as to a good environment to do that in. And so kids will choose outside of the school. That's one big reason. The second reason is that the risk around the endeavor of granting young people decision-making authority and giving them control of resources, which I would argue are the two core factors for really pushing the boundaries here, is that it is much safer to do that outside of school, because you are not risking learning time and people don't perceive you to be risking learning time. And it is also a great opportunity to then demonstrate what that young person is capable of, and for other people to see it, to Camille's great point about that people have to see this. And so I've spent my whole career in schools and in systems and leading states, and we made a very purposeful choice, or the young people made a very purposeful choice, to execute Grip Tape as a starting place outside of school. We have some schools adopting our approaches now that we're building, but we operate outside of school, and now we operate almost solely youth to youth.
Nice. Does that make you have ideas about how to help schools foster agency better now that you've been doing this outside of school? Is it possible?
Yeah, of course it's possible. And yes, I have ideas. And the ideas that I have, the best ones come directly from the mouths of teenagers. And so our young people, 15, 16, 17 years old, are experiencing school and have for a very long time in the present tense. That's something that we are not experiencing and haven't experienced in a while. And so their perspectives on how school can change are actually incredibly valuable and often articulated in a significantly better way than as adults. And so we are actually doing some, starting to do some like youth consulting, youth helping adults to grant greater levels of agency opportunity to young people. And I would just say two very small things. One is that teenagers feel very strongly after having experienced significant levels of agency in their own learning that the walls of school are a significant impediment. That if my learning has to be done in this place where there are four walls and I cannot go interview that doctor, experience that program over there, go walk down the street and talk to 10 people, if I can't do those things, that I lose a significant level of my learning and certainly the authenticity of what I aim to pursue. And so that's one, removing the four walls as best as possible. And there's a lot of schools doing that. And secondly, start small. Like don't bite off too much. You know, if we're going to grant young people the opportunities to display significant levels of agency with resources, with decision making, with real outcomes that they are defining, those types of things, then don't bite off too much than people can handle, because then they will just pull the reins in when the going gets tough. So do a little experiment and get rid of the four walls.
I love that. That last comment, you know, people pull the reins back when the going gets tough. And then earlier you used the word safe. You know, so we have a question from the audience member about, you know, being worried about kids veering off track or going down the wrong path, making that mistake. And really, how do you ensure that it doesn't go too far? Or how do you make sure it happens within the bounds that is like acceptable or tolerable or safe enough?
Yeah, I completely agree that you start small, and also to understand kind of the things that underlie agency. So there's a way in which when my colleagues and I here were doing a work for our Foundations for Young Adult Success report, we were looking at how these various things kind of develop from early childhood to young adulthood, and things like identity, you know, clearly change from the 3-year-old's conception of themselves to an 18-year-old's conception of themselves. It's like, you know, fundamentally different thing. But agency, there's a way in which agency is not really any different when you're 3 from when you're 18 or when you're 30. What's different is like the scope of things over which you have control. So like, you know, we think of like, you know, the little baby in their high chair throwing their peas, you know, like that, like they're exercising on the world. Like, this is something I can control. And it's just that as you get older, the things you can control, the domains and the realms at which you can exercise that control expand. But it's always about, and like, hopefully it's, the way you exercise agency is informed by more learning and thinking and knowledge, as somebody said before. But the basic idea of starting small, so giving people control over more reined-in things, and then I would also I sent you guys some slides, like the one slide that has the Foundations for Young Adult Success and the foundational components, because you know, agency rests on a bed of knowledge and skills, on developing kind of self-regulation, self-management, and mindsets and values. Yeah, here, thank you. And so agency and a more mature kind of integrated identity and real world competencies that are valued in, you know, outside of school, that those things all sit on those the green things underneath. And so one way to build students' agency is to just give them opportunities to develop the knowledge and skills that would inform allow them to make good decisions, or developing those mindsets of openness and growth mindset, and really kind of how do you understand the world? How do you see yourself in the world? And what's your kind of stance towards the world? And then I think the values piece is a really critical piece too. Like, what matters to you? What do you stand for? Like, what's really important in life? And so involving young people in kind of values-based decisions and conversations and discussions, all of that sets them up then that when they have, you can kind of hand over more and more control over more and more of what they do. It's sitting on this bedrock of preparation. So it's not just like all of a sudden you want to, okay, you guys just do whatever you want to make up whatever you want to do, without some kind of scaffold and support and some like actual development of their capacities.
Mm-hmm.
Can I hop in real quick? Because I appreciate what Ms. Camilla just said. I also want to make sure that I want to answer address the question that I think Jen Sue Hu, if I said that wrong, my apologies, where they were asking about what's the wrong path and how you stop a young person from veering off on the wrong path, and you're trying to be this trying to build agency, right? So, I think, so here's my just very oversimplified advice. I think that you start, I don't know what age group you're working with, but I think you start with a set of practices, rules, whatever you want to call it, and one that allows folks to have back and forth dialogue. So if I can build the right amount of trust and you can talk to me, and then you thinking about whatever that wrong path is, we can have a conversation about it so I can better understand why you want to go that route. I think that that's really important. I also think that the other thing around that's really important, and it's not always possible, but I think that is something that we should be thinking about if we run in schools and programs. I call them culturally relevant agents, and people that come from the backgrounds or that can reflect back what some folks might be talking about. So for instance, a teacher might have felt, let's say I was in love with Jay-Z music, right? And I just talked about being a rapper and being like that, right? If I don't have trust, we're never gonna get down to the root of why I want to do that. But if you trust me and I trust you, and over time we're having conversations, and what you really realize is I appreciate where Jay-Z came from. He was able to build. There are values rooted in what it is that wrong path might represent. So in my neighborhood, it was drug dealers. The people that I saw doing well sold drugs. It wasn't that I necessarily wanted to go out and sell drugs, but I wanted to have the respect, the command, the nice clothes and the things that they had. So somebody that knows what I'm talking about can then kind of show me other options and other ways to kind of get there. Like when we're talking about agency, I just think that that's like really, really important, because I've been in classrooms and I've seen young people say things like they wanted to go to the Army, or they wanted to go and do this, or they didn't want to go to college, they wanted to be an entrepreneur. And agency isn't me telling you what to do or what's good or what was bad, but it's me building enough inside of you and working with you and giving you a sounding board that you can weigh good and bad options well enough for yourself to make a decision. Because Steve Jobs leaving Reed College showed a hell of a lot of agency, right? Versus somebody didn't try because they didn't think they could get these grounded values that they cared about, accomplished. So Jen, I don't know if that totally answered your question, but I do think that if you build up the amount of trust, you get to ask an important question of why, and not in a judgmental way, but in a way that really helps you to understand where that person's coming from. And then there might be some gaps that you can fill in as the responsible adult in that situation.
But it sounds like there's a conversation that needs to happen to unpack like what kids want, and then by understanding what they want, helping them to figure out how to make decisions about how to get that. And it raised the question for me around readiness. So a lot of schools that I work with say, oh, I have a readiness rubric for agency. And if kids meet these 3 criteria, then they are ready for more choice or more this or more that. And so I want to put that out there to you folks and see, how do you all feel about that?
I have a visceral reaction to it, because we we as adults make all sorts of assumptions about the skill levels and readiness levels of our young people. And oftentimes those are faulty assumptions. We also rarely, if ever, start from the assumption that young people have the skills, the mindsets, the knowledge to pursue the things that they are passionate about. So imagine for a minute that we started with that assumption, that actually young people already have some level of skills, some level of knowledge, some level of growth mindset orientation to pursue their own learning, to design it, to direct it. Start with that assumption and then build up from nothing, not assume that they need these 5 things in place. I will say that we are in our 5th learning cycle, and each learning cycle we're testing some of these things out in these conditions. Here's a really interesting finding from us, is that we are measuring things like self-regulation, self-reflection, goal setting, forethought. And what we are seeing is that the level of those skills is far less important for the success of the young person than things like growth mindset and passion. In other words, the way oversimplified way to say it is that if the young person cares about what they are pursuing, that I want to learn this, I want to contribute to this, I want to help solve this problem, I care about this, self-described passion and interest, that will lead the way, that will win the day for that young person, even if they have significant lower skills at self-regulation, goal setting, those types of things. And so the opportunity for us as adults is to assume that young people are capable, to truly ask them what they're interested in and what they're passionate about, and then equip them with some of the tools and resources to pursue that passion without assuming that their lack of self-regulation that we see, or executive functioning skills, will get in their way.
Just to piggyback really quickly, because I really agree with what Mark's saying, and just this idea of starting with a different set of assumptions about students. The other reason why I have kind of a visceral reaction to this notion of readiness is I think it assumes that agency is largely something that resides within kids, and some have it and some don't, and some have more and some have less. And I think as educators, we have a lot more efficacy if we start to think of agency as something we activate in students, and that it's environmental and it's conditional. So I think as adults, we can all think about environments we've been in where we felt well supported and well situated to make decisions for ourselves, to make confident choices, to do all the things we would consider a student or a person with agency doing. And we can think of other environments and other spaces where we've been less able to do that. So I think agency is of course something that, we can grow and develop in people, but I think it's also a feature of environments and of contexts. And I think to sort of talk about readiness misses the mark for educators around saying, what am I doing to create conditions where students can exhibit agency or develop agency?
That seems like a perfect segue to what are schools or learning environments currently doing wrong, and what are they currently doing right? Maybe some examples that you guys have seen from your work. Maybe a good frame is like, do this, not that.
Mm-hmm.
As somebody who went through traditional public education, had parents that was on drugs, went to 11 elementary schools, went to 2 high schools and all that good stuff. I think that, like I'm listening, and I think a lot of things sound really good on paper, and I think a lot of things sound good in theory. And when I talk to parents now, right, like I think that sometimes it's difficult and hard for a parent to swallow you trying to do a bunch of extra stuff when you're a math teacher and my kid can't do math when they leave your class. In California, 1 in 4 Black boys, only 1 in 4 are reading at grade level. So it's cool if you're the English teacher and we having conversations about agency and we talking about these bigger, loftier things, right? But if my kid still can't read when he leave you, like I need you to focus on that piece, right? I think that's why we when we work with parents, we work with parents and we look at the school as one of the factors in a network of things that will like help your child develop. So I think one of the things that I felt when I was in school, man, was that I wanted to see now that I can look back as an adult that's kind of traveled the country and seen successful education and really, really unsuccessful education. What are the 2-3 things that you just gonna be good at? Like, what are the things that you are good at? Say those things up front, and then like have partners help you fill in the gaps. So if it's like, look, we get kids out of here at reading level. All right, cool. Well, I need to go somewhere else to get like the Black mentor for my child or the agency. Like trust me enough as a part of your team, right? Like, and this is what I tell parents: you are the quarterback of this team. I don't care what your education level is, I don't care how smart you think you are, you know, that whatever. Like, you are the expert on your child, so like you have to kind of include that parent and that community in the development of that child. And I think that we tend to make a mistake and we feel like the school got to do it all, because you can barely do your part right. So taking on all this other stuff, I think it's going to set us all up kind of for failure, right? And that's just from what I've experienced, right? Like, I mean, in 8th grade, like my best friend, like I don't know, I had like, just like my friends were dying, right? When I was in school, you feel me? Like, it's so, and none of them could read, you feel me? Like, I remember the last day that my friend came to school, was in the 9th grade in the world history class, and asked him to read out loud, and he couldn't, and he just never came back. You know what I mean? And I think that, so all this other extra stuff is important, and it should be at the basis of what we do as educators. But like at the end of the day, like, what is your job? What were you hired to do? Are you good at that? Is your lesson plan on point? Like, is this scaffolded to like where, you know what I'm saying, if this is working and this ain't working, that I can like actually engage these young people? And do I have a plan for the folks that I feel like I'm about to lose? And I promise y'all I won't take up no more space after that. But that's what that was when I was listening. And I think these are great answers, but those are the things that were coming up for me in that piece.
I really appreciate that. It's a really good provocation, right? I feel like what you're saying is, the question that raises for me is foundational knowledge and skill mutually exclusive from agency?
Right, and that's, I would push back a little bit on that idea of so I completely buy the premise that like if kids have all this agency but don't actually have any knowledge and skills and can't do stuff like be a good reader, then that's highly problematic and that's a bad model. So I think we can all agree on that. But I don't then think that then you have to only focus on kind of basic knowledge and basic skills before you can get to agency, because I think that there's pretty clear evidence to the point about that Mark made before around passion, and that if you can teach academic content in such a way that connects it to things kids are passionate about, that fuels them to learn that academic content much more deeply than if you're doing it in a much more kind of rote way. And I think there's pretty clear evidence that that is the case. Kids will be much more perseverant. They're going to work a lot harder. They're not going to give up when they get frustrated if they care about what it is they're doing than if they don't. So I think that I don't think it's an either or, like you have to just focus on academics because that focusing on agency pulls away from academics. I think that's kind of a false dichotomy. That being said, it's not agency for just agency's sake, right? Schools actually do have have a job to do in terms of making sure that kids learn something and have real world competencies and know some stuff. And so I think that you can find that path, with a focus on agency and not trade one for the other in either direction.
Yeah, I would hate for. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Drew. I wanted to get Ramon's take on this because you're kind of at the intersection of training teachers and leaders and equity, and so this idea of whether or not basic academic skills and agency are mutually exclusive And then especially for students who have a lot of things going on, like what do you have to say about the intersection of those things?
I definitely would say they kind of have to happen simultaneously. So, you know, in my class, if I have a student that's not reading on grade level, I need to give them the skill set to say, hey, I'm not understanding this, and this is what I might need help with. And you see, it's kind of like, I see it as both. I'm just thinking my experience being a teacher in Baltimore City Public Schools, that often you come to my class, students were kind of meek and mild and thought asking the teacher for help was a sign of weakness. But I kind of had to just reframe what that looked like for them. And I think once they got the idea, oh, I'm asking for help, I'm taking control, is a way for me to learn. Once they started understanding like that, it was a much easier transition for them to advocate on other things. And again, as they're reading and those basic skills increased, they were able to advocate in different types of ways and more, I guess, nuanced ways once they got that kind of background knowledge.
Drew, you had something to add to that. I interrupted you. I apologize.
Oh, no, not at all. I really appreciate that direction there. You know, I will say, I also would hope that we wouldn't get into a situation where we would think about the cultivation of agency type skills as doing extra things, but that it's really about redesigning schools to do school in a different way where that's happening at the forefront. And it really is about, I mean, I think lots of times we've been kind of skirting around this idea that it's really about a different understanding of what teaching and learning really entail, and what kinds of relationships between adults and students really takes to do that. And while I'd acknowledge there's tons of ways to do that, like for our organization, we tend to work in we try to create like pretty non-traditional schools in pretty traditional systems. So, I mean, pretty simply, our main vehicle is we try to do really authentic project-based learning with students where we task kids to solve real-world problems. So the teacher creates a sense of direction because they do have an obligation to make sure students are learning what they've been tasked with teaching them. But within that container where you task kids with solving a really strong, authentic real-world problem, ideally connected to the community so you can get them out there showing the community what kids are capable of, right? But once you've got them into this line of teacher designed inquiry, you have spaces and opportunities for students to say, here's what I already know, here's what I need to know, here's what I think our next steps might be, here's what I think I've learned. And so again, I think there's lots of ways to do it. We, for us, have really found that trying to help teachers design, you know, inquiry type projects is a really effective vehicle to build that skill set with kids.
Thank you. Other specific thoughts about how to design learning environments that foster agency? You know, when people walk away from this call, what are the things that they should go and try to do?
Well, I would piggyback on Drew. So, because one way to approach the issue is how do you get teacher mindsets like in the right place where that they can lead that work? How do you set up structures? How do you, you know, train people up to do that? But I think that a vehicle like you know, a project-based learning model that's kind of like, you know, you can think of it as like the Trojan horse thing that you can like drive into the school, and it's kind of laid out. It expects that teachers are going to give opportunities and choice and autonomy to kids. It spells out how to the teacher they should support those things. I think that there are some really good models where it's easier to implement a model than it is to on your own try to figure out how you're going to change your whole school. And by digging into like, because you know, like a project-based learning model, for example, which I think, you know, kind of an expeditionary model, a project-based learning model, a personalized learning model, like any kind of thing where you already have a vehicle that speaks to the teacher in language they know, because it's around curriculum, it's around instruction, it's around assessment, it's around this is how you do those pieces, is a lot easier than to start with like, let's change everybody's mind about what ought to happen in school. You know, I think it's more like the proof in the pudding. You start doing that model and then you start seeing what kids can do. And then you are, you know, oh, get excited to go do more things. I think it's just, it's like an easier entry point from what I've seen. Mm-hmm. And just kind of adding on to that, we all know examples where the same teacher in a traditional setting does very traditional instruction, and you plop that teacher in a different setting, and they can do very different kinds of work. And if you stick them back in here, they're very constrained again into what they can do. So I guess I'm making the point that it's not really all about teacher training and teacher mindsets. It's about the systems in which they're trying to work.
Yeah. Is there a middle ground? I mean, at Transcend, right, we're also trying to like press the reset on school models, and we're trying to design new learning environments, but not everyone has that luxury. So is there a middle ground?
One really quick thing is just like an emphasis on student voice, like just ask kids, you know, ask them for their feedback on things, ask them what they want to learn, ask them what they're interested in, ask them how that unit went. You know, just the more that you have opportunities for kids to actually be able to express their opinions, then, you know, that's kind of a good place to start. And as Mark said, you know, kids have way better ideas than we ever will about what would be better for them. So I think it's got to start with just providing opportunities for kids to express their opinions.
To build on that for a second, I think the research is showing that most kids have virtually no say in anything that has to do with their instruction or learning inside our schools. That they may have say over school uniform, dance, whatever, but clubs, but it's not about their learning. It's not about the curriculum. It's not about the pedagogical processes. And so a middle ground is to provide some of that voice through a level of decision making or some level of decision making. To young people within the school, and it's voiced specifically around things that impact their learning.
Any thoughts? So provocation for you all. I notice in the schools that, at least that I visited, the wealthier schools, the high income schools tend to feel a lot of freedom around giving kids agency and allowing them voice and choice over things that impact their actual learning. And kids that go to disproportionately low income schools do not have that option. So how do we help, you know, like should we help those schools also foster agency? And then how do we do that? Because there is this discrepancy that's happening between who gets to be agents of their learning and who actually doesn't.
I think if we go back to the definition of agency as being able to decide for yourself about what it is that's important to you, then it becomes really critical that it's not, you know, kind of outside reformers coming in and dictating how this ought to go down, but really, to Charles's point, drawing on the community and the parents to really be centrally involved in what they want for their kids, what that ought to look like. And Charles, I also really appreciated your point about trusting relationships, because when you have a trusting relationship, you can push people on, like if what they know is the way I went to school and that's what I expect. I don't have a picture of something any different than that. If you have trusting relationships with people, you can push on that. And but it's got to be not doing it. You can't do agency to people.
And to build on that, I would actually point back to something Ramon said earlier on about developing that in new teachers, and simply that the way that we're going to engage with our teachers as learners and engage with our teachers as people in the system has to be reflective of the way we want them to deal with students. You know, a teacher made a comment at one of the convenings I was at in South Carolina recently that, you know, that the teachers can't give what they don't have. And she was thinking about the structures in their school around whether teachers had sufficient voice and decision-making authority to help be involved in the school itself. And so we often think about like nesting dolls. So when we think about the classroom environment that we want teachers to be responsible for creating, school leaders are sort of they're sort of responsible for creating a similar learning environment that mirrors the same kinds of dynamics and trust and autonomy that we would want them to provide for their students. And so with the more challenging student environments that I've worked in, it also is a situation where the teachers are, you know, heavily managed and, you know, have almost no sense of their own, you know, there's really low belief in those teachers as being people who can make good work happen.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I had a thought, and I wanted to go back and really appreciate what Dr. Goins has said a little earlier on, and you know where, and I want to be clear, I wasn't I wasn't trying to build an dichotomy between like agency and actual practice, but I'm looking as somebody who is like looking all over the country, and the people getting the worst education look a certain way and make under a certain amount of money. And I think that like we are having a really good conversation. We're building a house and we are talking about some very beautiful windows and the upstairs bathroom, right? But we haven't done any work on the foundation. And so when those people are not being represented in that education space, we know that less than 2% of these teachers are Black males. We know that there's not a lot of Latino males in these spaces. We know that there's not a lot of positive Latino women like that these folks can look at. So these are amazing educators, right? But I remember like the educators that I looked at that I just couldn't identify with, and on some level I felt like they were lying to me. Like I felt like or I don't want to do that. I don't, like when Dr. Goins comes in and he's Dr. Goins and he looks like me, or like, you know, I'm finishing up my doctorate as well, right? But there are days when I wear a tie and a suit, but there's also days when I wear this hat. That is a silent form of building agency in those people that look like me. And it comes out in the conversations that I'm having. So what I've been saying, and I worked in OUSD for 2 years, right? For 3 years in the superintendent's office and in classrooms and stuff. Like a lot of these things, and I think some people said in the chat, let's also be real about traditional school settings, right? Like you are restricted in certain things that you can do, right? So I think that that's why folks are asking for specific things. So within the bounds of what it is that your school may allow or may not allow you to do, what are some things that you can do to kind of build agency? It's okay if you don't look like those kids, but how are you bringing in folks that look like them to have real conversation? How are you like incorporating the opportunity for those young people's experiences to come in? And this is where I think nervous, right? When they say, "Oh, we're gonna give you kids agency," and what they hear is, your kids gonna tell us how to do our lesson. That's not what that is, right? But those real life conversations allow for a good educator to then build around the nuances that these young people are bringing up. I think those are like tangible ways. So when we talk about a middle ground, I think a middle ground is saying, hey, are our teachers able to do that active listening? What skills can we help build in our teachers that actually get young people being more inquisitive and inquiring about certain things? How can I like then meld their answers and their curiosities with my lesson plans? That when I talk about being a good educator, those are the things that I'm talking about, right? Is how do I like take that stuff that they give me and then give them back gold that reflects them? So I just want to be very like clear on that. But when we talk about those middling places, because we know that you're not gonna be able to fire a whole bunch of people and bring in a whole bunch of new people. We know you're not gonna be able to always just build from the ground up, right? So like, if I'm one of the administrators there, I'm listening. I want to listen to see how my teacher's listening. How is my teacher responding to folks, right? And I think that you can build supports and you can build like trainings to like support your teachers and educators in those type of ways.
I would just add that even in a traditional school, there's a lot you can do as a teacher within, particularly at like the high school level. Like I don't know about elementary school. I imagine that's also true, but at the high school level. So I used to teach in Oakland, and it was a business English class, and you walk in the first day and they give you, here's the book, what you're supposed to do with everybody, and you're supposed to teach them how to take a memo and how to do that. Like it was really ridiculous, and in my class were almost all young men of color. And I'm like, they don't care about taking a memo or being able to write a business line. So then but no one, the good thing is nobody cared what was going on in business English class because they had already written off all those kids. And so you could really say, so I was like, okay, well, let's everybody make a business plan. Like what's something you really want to figure out how to do? And if you had some money and you could start a business, like what would you do? And they, figured out like what they wanted to do, and they contacted people and interviewed people who did stuff they were along the lines of what they did, and they, learned how to they had to write and rewrite to be able to write letters to people and be able to express their plans. And it was just a fundamentally different thing than what the curriculum was. So I think that there's a lot of latitude that oftentimes that teachers can have, and particularly with kids that have basically already been written off, because it's like, what's the counterfactual, right? Like it's not like because the expectations for those kids are so low, right? So that you can have a little more leeway, I think, to push the envelope and demonstrate, let the kids demonstrate what they're capable of doing.
One super quick follow-up on that is that I feel like sometimes educators feel like they're a part of the system and they do not have the ability to change this and don't have the ability to institute these types of practices. And one thing that we can keep in mind is that our young people spend 70 to 80% of their waking hours outside of a classroom in the period of a year. And so that is 70 to 80% of a young person's time that can be tapped into for amazing opportunities. And there's nothing to say that the school, that the educators, that the kids themselves can't partner with other opportunities outside of the school walls and the 6.5 hours a day, and do things during that other 70 to 80% of time.
Thanks, Mark. All right, so we are at time. So a few housekeeping things. We're going to keep this open for 30 minutes for informal conversation if folks want to stick around and talk to each other. Transcend will send out some more resources and information and the video of this. To close out though, if each of you could go around and just say, what's one thing, for the people who are listening, what's one thing I should read or one thing I should do? And maybe a variety of things I could do in the current system. And if I could press reset, like I'm building brand new school, I could press reset. What should I do? So just go around and just give us some parting words.
I would love it if everybody read the Foundations for Young Adult Success report, so I'll give that a plug. But in terms of I would say go visit a youth development organization and see what's happening there. Like find a place in your community that's doing something with kids outside of school time and learn from the way that's structured, the way, what's happening there.
Camille's work and that paper were one of the most impactful things that I've read in the last 5 years. And so I want to second that. Read the paper. But secondly is if you work with young people, make sure you know what they are passionate about, what they're really interested in. And if you don't know, go ask them.
Yeah, Mark took my answer. If it's just like something concrete, like when in doubt, ask them. Ask them first. Ask them before you tell them. So.
I would say if you're working, if you're a school leader, I would say take a needs assessment of your teachers to make sure that they have the skill to actually help students in this way. And then if you're working with kids, do the same thing with kids. They'll tell you what they want and they'll be very forthcoming with that information if you do it in a way that you'll actually use the information to implement some type of change in that setting.
Charles, the final word.
Oh, I think folks said some really great stuff. I put in the comments our website where our students have published their work and just giving you their real experiences in school and what they're passionate about. So you can go check it out.
All right. Thank you so much. This is like me giving you all appreciations and thanking you for a very lively conversation. Appreciate the back and forth and the agreements and disagreements, and you guys